I stood in my kitchen at 72 years old, staring at my own family gathered around my dining table, and realized they thought I was losing my mind. What started as innocent comments about my forgetfulness had escalated into whispered conversations about memory care facilities and power of attorney documents. They had no idea that behind my supposedly failing memory lay decades of carefully guarded family secrets, and when they pushed me too far, I would prove just how sharp my mind really was by revealing every single truth I'd spent years protecting them from. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun streamed through my kitchen window in Phoenix, casting long shadows across the terracotta tiles as I watched my son David pace back and forth like a caged animal. His wife Amanda sat rigidly at my breakfast table, her manicured fingers drumming against the surface with the kind of nervous energy that preceded uncomfortable conversations. My granddaughter Grace, 9 years old with her father's stubborn chin and my late husband's kind eyes, colored quietly in the corner while 5-year-old Ben built an elaborate tower with blocks he'd found in my toy basket. I'd been living in this ranch-style house for 37 years, ever since Robert and I moved to Arizona for his job with the engineering firm downtown. The desert landscape had grown on me slowly, the way most things of value do. What once seemed harsh and unforgiving had revealed itself to be resilient and beautiful, much like the life Robert and I had built together before cancer took him 6 years ago. Now, standing in my own kitchen, where I'd hosted countless family dinners and birthday celebrations, I felt like a stranger being evaluated by visitors who'd already made up their minds about my competence. The conversation that was coming had been building for weeks, ever since I'd forgotten Amanda's birthday last month and mixed up the dates for Grace's school play the week before. "Mom," David began, his voice carrying that particular tone adult children use when they're about to treat their parents like children. "We need to talk about some things we've been noticing." I continued washing the lunch dishes, my movements deliberate and calm despite the anxiety building in my chest. After 45 years of marriage and raising 3 children, I'd learned that sometimes the best defense was to let people reveal their intentions before responding. Amanda cleared her throat, a sound I'd come to associate with her need to control every conversation. "Erica, we're concerned about some recent incidents that suggest you might be having some memory issues." The phrase hung in the air like an accusation. Memory issues. The polite euphemism for what they really suspected but were too afraid to say directly. I set down the plate I'd been washing and turned to face them, noting how David avoided direct eye contact while Amanda met my gaze with the clinical detachment of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. "What kind of incidents?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. They'd been cataloging my mistakes for months, building a case like prosecutors preparing for trial. David pulled out his phone and began reading from what was obviously a prepared list. "You forgot Amanda's birthday completely. You showed up to Grace's school play on the wrong night. Last week you called me 3 times asking the same question about Ben's soccer schedule. Yesterday Patricia found you wandering around the neighborhood at midnight in your nightgown. That last accusation hit me like a slap. Patricia Wilson, my neighbor of 15 years, had indeed found me outside at midnight, but I hadn't been wandering confused. I'd been checking my garden's sprinkler system because I'd heard an unusual sound and wanted to make sure there wasn't a leak that would waste water and damage my desert landscaping. Patricia knew this because I'd explained it to her at the time, but apparently my explanation had been filtered through the lens of their growing suspicions about my mental state. "I wasn't wandering," I said quietly. "I was checking my irrigation system." Amanda's laugh held no humor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "At midnight? In your nightgown?" "Erica, that's exactly the kind of behavior we're talking about. It's not normal for someone to be outside in the middle of the night doing yard work." Grace looked up from her coloring book, her young face creased with confusion. "Grandma, were you really outside in your pajamas?" The question came from a place of innocent curiosity, but it felt like another piece of evidence being added to their case against me. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that adults sometimes make mountains out of molehills? That concern can transform into suspicion so gradually that caring people convince themselves they're helping when they're actually attacking. I was checking something in the yard, sweetheart, I told her honestly. Sometimes grown-ups have to take care of problems when they notice them, even if it's late at night. David ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was frustrated and trying to find the right words. Mom, that's just it. These aren't really problems that needed immediate attention. The sprinkler system has been working fine for years. Patricia said you seemed confused about why you were outside. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that came whenever I realized my own family was choosing to believe someone else's interpretation of my actions over my own explanation. Patricia Wilson meant well, but she was 78 years old herself and had a tendency to dramatize situations. Her version of events, filtered through David and Amanda's growing concerns, had transformed a practical middle-of-the-night maintenance check into evidence of cognitive decline. I was not confused, I said, each word measured and clear. I heard a sound that suggested a possible water leak. I went outside to investigate. When Patricia saw me, I explained exactly what I was doing and why. If she interpreted that as confusion, that's her misunderstanding, not mine. Amanda leaned forward with the patient expression people use when they think they're dealing with someone who doesn't understand their own limitations. Erica, we're not attacking you. We love you and we're worried. These little incidents are adding up, and we think it might be time to have you evaluated by a doctor who specializes in memory issues. The word evaluated made my skin crawl, as if I were a malfunctioning appliance that needed professional assessment before being discarded. I looked at my son, the boy I'd raised from infancy, taught to ride a bicycle, helped with homework through countless late nights, and saw a stranger who'd already decided I was incompetent. What kind of evaluation? I asked, though part of me already knew where this conversation was heading. David pulled a business card from his wallet, handling it like it contained the solution to all their problems. Dr. Martinez at the Phoenix Memory Center. She specializes in cognitive assessments for seniors. We could schedule an appointment next week. Ben's block tower toppled over with a crash that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly tense kitchen. He looked up at the adults with the kind of awareness that children possess when they sense undercurrents they don't fully understand. Why is everyone talking so serious? He asked, his 5-year-old vocabulary struggling to capture the gravity he felt in the room. Grace set down her crayons and moved closer to her little brother, her protective instincts already developing despite her young age. They're talking about Grandma going to the doctor, she said with the matter-of-fact tone children use when they're processing adult complications. I knelt down to Ben's level, gathering the scattered blocks while I gathered my thoughts. Sometimes adults have conversations about taking care of each other, I told him gently. Just like when you have to go to the doctor for checkups. But even as I said the words, I knew this wasn't the same thing. Routine medical care was about maintaining health. This was about my family systematically building a case that I was no longer capable of managing my own life. Standing back up, I faced David and Amanda with what I hoped was calm dignity. And what happens after this evaluation? What are you hoping to accomplish? The look that passed between them told me everything I needed to know. They'd already discussed this extensively, probably with lawyers and financial advisors and anyone else who could help them navigate the legal complexities of what they saw as inevitable. We just want to make sure you're safe, Mom, David said, but his eyes held the same expression I'd seen when he was 12 years old, and trying to convince me he hadn't broken my favorite vase. Safe from what, exactly? Amanda took over, her voice carrying the efficient tone she used in her job as a hospital administrator. Erica, people with memory issues can face serious safety risks. Leaving stoves on, forgetting to lock doors, taking medications incorrectly. We're not trying to control your life. We're trying to protect it. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 72 years, I'd been protecting other people's lives, keeping their secrets, smoothing over their mistakes, maintaining the careful balance that held our family together. Now they wanted to protect me from myself, based on a handful of minor incidents that they'd transformed into evidence of mental decline. I walked to my kitchen counter where I kept a small notebook, the kind I'd used for years to track appointments and important dates. Opening it to the current week, I began reading aloud. Monday, dental cleaning at 10:30 with Dr. Rodriguez. Tuesday, volunteer shift at the community center from 1 to 4. Wednesday, grocery shopping, and Patricia's doctor appointment at 2:15. Thursday, Grace's piano recital at 7 p.m. Ben's soccer practice canceled due to rain. Friday, book club meeting at the library, discussion of The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I closed the notebook and looked at their faces, noting the surprise in their expressions. This is last week's schedule. Every appointment kept, every commitment honored, every detail remembered and recorded. Does this sound like someone with memory issues? David shifted uncomfortably. Mom, writing things down doesn't prove your memory is fine. Lots of people with early cognitive decline use compensation strategies. Compensation strategies. Another clinical term that transformed normal organizational habits into symptoms of disease. I'd been writing in appointment books for 40 years, long before anyone questioned my mental acuity. Now the same behavior was being reframed as evidence that I was struggling to function. What would prove to you that my memory is fine? I asked, genuinely curious about what standard of evidence they'd accept. Amanda and David exchanged another look. The kind of wordless communication that happens between people who've already decided on a course of action and are now just managing the implementation. Professional evaluation, Amanda said firmly. A qualified doctor doing proper cognitive testing, not just remembering appointments or daily activities, but comprehensive assessment of memory function, problem-solving abilities, and judgment. Judgment. That word hit harder than the others, because it revealed what this was really about. They weren't just questioning whether I could remember where I put my keys or what day of the week it was. They were questioning whether I was capable of making good decisions about my own life. I thought about the decisions I'd been making successfully for the past 6 years since Robert's death. Managing my finances, maintaining my house, staying involved in my grandchildren's lives, volunteering at the community center where I helped coordinate meals for homebound seniors. Not once had any of these activities suffered due to memory problems or poor judgment. But I also thought about the decisions they didn't know I'd been making. The family secrets I'd been keeping for decades. The careful balance of truth and discretion that had protected multiple family members from consequences they weren't ready to face. Those secrets required excellent memory and careful judgment, and I'd been managing them successfully for years. Grace had been listening to the adult conversation with the intensity children bring to discussions they sense are important, but don't fully understand. Now she spoke up with the directness that adults often find uncomfortable. Grandma, are you sick? The question hung in the air like a challenge. How do you explain to a child that illness isn't always about germs or broken bones? That sometimes families can convince themselves that love looks like taking control of someone else's? No, sweetheart, I said, kneeling down to her level again. I'm not sick. Some people are worried that I might be having trouble remembering things, but I feel fine. But you do remember things, Grace said with the logical certainty of childhood. You remembered my birthday and bought me the art set I wanted. You remembered that Ben doesn't like tomatoes when you made lunch. You remember all the stories about Grandpa Robert? From the mouths of babes. Grace had articulated what the adults seemed determined to ignore, that my memory functioned perfectly well for the things that mattered. I remembered what was important to the people I loved. I remembered their preferences, their fears, their dreams, their secrets. Especially their secrets. Standing up again, I faced my son and daughter-in-law with a new kind of clarity. They wanted to evaluate my memory. They wanted to test my cognitive function. They had no idea what they were asking for. You know what? I said, my voice steady and calm. I think you're right. I think it's time for an evaluation. But not the kind you're suggesting. David looked relieved, probably thinking I was finally accepting their assessment of my condition. Great, Mom. I'll call Dr. Martinez tomorrow and set up an appointment. No, I said quietly. I think we should evaluate my memory right here, right now. You want to know if I can remember things clearly? Let's test that theory. Amanda's expression shifted from relief to uncertainty. What do you mean? I walked to my living room, gesturing for them to follow. The walls were lined with family photographs spanning decades. Weddings, graduations, birthday parties, holiday gatherings. Generations of faces smiled back at us, each image containing stories that went far beyond what the camera had captured. "You think I'm losing my memory," I said, stopping in front of the mantelpiece where my favorite family photos were displayed. "You think I'm confused about reality, that I can't trust my own recollections. So let's put that theory to the test." I picked up a photograph from David's wedding 15 years ago, studying the faces of family members gathered to celebrate what everyone had assumed would be a perfect marriage. Amanda stood beside David in her white dress, radiant with happiness and completely unaware of what I knew about her past. "This is from your wedding day," I said, showing them the picture. "Beautiful ceremony, wonderful reception. Everyone was so happy." I paused, meeting Amanda's eyes directly. Of course, some people had more reason to be nervous than others. Something flickered in Amanda's expression. A quick flash of recognition, followed by carefully controlled neutrality. "I don't know what you mean. Don't you?" I set down the wedding photo and picked up another one, this time from a family barbecue about 5 years ago. This was taken the summer David got the promotion at work. Everyone was celebrating his success. I pointed to a figure in the background of the photo, including Marcus Thompson from his office. Such a nice man, very married, very discreet. The color drained from Amanda's face, but she maintained her composure with the skill of someone who'd had practice managing uncomfortable situations. "Erica, I think you might be confused about." "Am I?" I interrupted gently. "Because my memory of that particular summer is quite clear. The late-night phone calls you thought no one noticed. The sudden interest in working overtime. The new perfume you started wearing." I met her gaze steadily. "The receipt I found in your car for the hotel room downtown." David looked back and forth between his wife and me, confusion replacing his earlier confidence. "What are you talking about, Mom?" This was the moment I'd been dreading for 5 years. The moment when protecting someone else's secret came into direct conflict with protecting my own credibility. I'd kept quiet about Amanda's affair because I'd believed that families sometimes needed protection from truths that would destroy them. But now that same family was using my discretion against me, questioning my memory and judgment, while demanding professional evaluation of my cognitive abilities. "I'm talking about the fact that my memory works perfectly well," I said calmly. "I'm talking about the difference between forgetting and choosing not to speak. For years I've chosen to keep certain information private out of respect for family harmony, but apparently my discretion has been mistaken for confusion." Amanda's carefully maintained composure began to crack. "You don't understand the situation. It was complicated. David and I were going through a difficult time, and Marcus was just a friend?" I suggested. "Is that what we're calling it? Because my memory recalls several conversations where you referred to him quite differently, usually late at night when you thought everyone in the house was asleep." Grace and Ben had been following this conversation with the fascination children bring to adult drama they don't quite understand. Now Grace spoke up with the uncomfortable directness that had always been her trademark. "Mommy, what's Grandma talking about?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Amanda looked at her daughter, then at her husband, then at me with something approaching panic in her eyes. "She's confused, sweetheart," Amanda said quickly. "Sometimes when people get older, they mix up memories and think things happened that didn't really happen." But even as she said the words, her voice lacked conviction. Grace studied her mother's face with the intensity children bring to moments when they sense adults aren't telling the truth. "Are you mixed up, Grandma?" Grace asked me directly. I knelt down to her level one more time, meeting her honest gaze with my own. "No, sweetheart. I'm not mixed up. I just know things that some people wish I didn't know." David had been silent during this exchange, processing information that was clearly reshaping his understanding of his marriage and his mother's mental state. Now he spoke with the voice of someone trying to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his management. "Mom, even if what you're saying is true, it doesn't change the fact that you've been having memory lapses. Forgetting birthdays, missing appointments, the incident with Patricia." "I didn't forget Amanda's birthday," I said quietly. I chose not to acknowledge it that year because I was angry about her behavior and didn't trust myself to be appropriately civil. I attended Grace's school play on the wrong night because Amanda gave me incorrect information, probably hoping I'd miss it entirely. And I've already explained about the sprinkler system. The silence in the room was deafening. Even Ben seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted in the adult dynamics, and he moved closer to his sister, with the instinctual need for security that children feel when their world becomes unpredictable. David sank into my recliner, his head in his hands as he processed the implications of what I'd revealed. "How long have you known?" "About the affair?" "Since the beginning." "About your plan to have me evaluated for memory problems?" "Since last month, when you thought I couldn't hear you discussing it on the phone." Amanda's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the fear beneath her controlled exterior. "You can't prove any of this. And even if you could, it has nothing to do with whether you're experiencing cognitive decline." I walked back to the mantelpiece and picked up another photograph, this one from David's high school graduation, 25 years ago. "You're right that it doesn't prove my cognitive function, but it does prove something else important." I turned the photo toward them, pointing to a figure in the background who most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking carefully. "This man attended your graduation, David, even though we'd specifically asked him not to come." David looked at the photo, squinting at the figure I was indicating. "I don't recognize him." "You wouldn't. You never knew he was there." "But I did, because I'd been watching for him." I set the photo down carefully. "Your biological father wanted to see you graduate, despite the restraining order your stepfather Robert had filed against him." The bomb I'd just dropped seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. David stared at me with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of their life had just been rewritten. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. This was the secret I'd sworn I'd never reveal. The truth that Robert and I had agreed would serve no purpose except to hurt everyone involved. David's biological father had been violent and unstable, disappearing from our lives when David was 2 years old after Robert adopted him and gave him his name. We'd told David that his father had died, a lie that seemed kinder than the truth about abandonment and restraining orders. But now, faced with accusations about my memory and judgment, I found myself revealing truths I'd spent decades protecting. "I'm talking about the fact that my memory goes back much further than you realize," I said gently. "I remember things you never knew happened. I remember conversations you never heard. I remember decisions that were made to protect you from information we thought would hurt you." Amanda had gone completely pale, probably realizing that if I was willing to reveal this secret, there were likely others that could be equally devastating. "Erica, you're upset and you're saying things that are true, that shatter the comfortable narratives we've all been living with?" I moved to another photograph, this one from Amanda's baby shower when she was pregnant with Grace. "Should I talk about why you were so adamant about having a home birth? Or would you prefer I discuss the real reason you've been seeing Dr. Patterson every month for the past 3 years? The questions hit Amanda like physical blows. She gripped the edge of my dining table so hard her knuckles went white, and I could see her calculating how much damage I was capable of inflicting if I continued down this path. "Stop," she said quietly. "Just stop." But I was beyond stopping. For months, they'd been building a case that I was mentally incompetent, cataloging my minor mistakes and reframing my normal behavior as symptoms of cognitive decline. They'd been preparing to take control of my life based on their conviction that I couldn't be trusted to make my own decisions. Now they were discovering that not only was my memory intact, it contained information that could destroy the careful illusions they'd built their lives around. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" I asked, looking between David and Amanda. "A test of my memory? An evaluation of my cognitive function? Well, here it is. My memory is perfect. I remember everything. Every secret, every lie, every uncomfortable truth that this family has spent years pretending doesn't exist." Grace had been listening with the wide-eyed fascination children bring to adult drama. But now she spoke up with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Grandma, if you remember everything, why didn't you tell us before?" The innocence of her question hit me harder than all of Amanda's accusations or David's concerns about my mental state. Why hadn't I told them? Why had I spent years protecting people who were now questioning my competence? Because sometimes, sweetheart, I said carefully, people aren't ready to hear the truth, and sometimes the people who love them choose to wait until they are ready. But we're ready now? Grace pressed with the relentless logic of childhood. I looked at David, still reeling from the revelation about his parentage, and Amanda, calculating how much more damage I might inflict, and Ben, building a new tower from blocks while the adult world collapsed around him. I don't think anyone is ever really ready for the truth, I admitted, but sometimes circumstances make it necessary anyway. The late afternoon sun was shifting, casting longer shadows across my living room as the weight of revealed secrets settled over us like dust after an explosion. Everything had changed in the span of an hour, and there was no going back to the comfortable pretenses we'd maintained for years. David finally looked up from his hands, his eyes red with unshed tears. Is any of it true? Anything you told me about my father, about our family, about who we are? The pain in his voice broke my heart, but I'd come too far to soften the truth now. Most of it is true. Robert loved you as his own son from the day he married me. He was your father in every way that mattered. The man who donated his genetics to your conception was never your father in any meaningful sense. But you lied to me. We protected you from information that would have hurt you without serving any beneficial purpose. There's a difference. Amanda finally found her voice again, though it came out shakier than her usual, controlled tone. And now? What's the purpose of revealing all this now? I turned to face her directly, noting how she'd aged in just the past hour as her carefully constructed world began to crumble around her. Now the purpose is proving that there's nothing wrong with my memory. You wanted a cognitive evaluation? Here it is. I remember everything, including things you've spent years hoping I'd forgotten or never known in the first place. The implications of what I'd revealed were still settling over them like aftershocks from an earthquake. David's parentage, Amanda's affair, whatever other secrets they suspected I might possess. All of it called into question not just their understanding of our family history, but their assessment of my mental competence. So what happens now? David asked quietly. I looked around my living room, at the photographs that held so many hidden stories, at my grandchildren who were processing adult complications they shouldn't have to understand yet, at my son and daughter-in-law who'd come here to convince me I needed professional help, and were now discovering they might need it themselves. Now, I said simply, we decide whether we want to keep living with comfortable lies or start building something based on uncomfortable truths. The afternoon was getting late, and soon David and Amanda would need to take the children home for dinner and homework, and the normal routines of family life. But nothing would be normal anymore. The secrets I'd spent decades protecting were out in the open, and there was no putting them back. As I watched my family grapple with their new reality, I realized that my memory wasn't the thing that had been failing all along. It was our ability to trust each other with the truth. The silence that followed my revelations stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. I watched David's face cycle through emotions I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, caught in lies too big to explain away. Amanda sat frozen at my dining table, her perfect composure finally cracked like expensive china dropped on concrete. Grace and Ben sensed the shift in adult energy the way children always do, moving closer together on my living room carpet while their block towers lay forgotten. I walked to my kitchen and filled the kettle with water, my hands steady despite the earthquake I'd just triggered in my own living room. After 72 years of keeping other people's secrets, the act of revealing them felt both liberating and terrifying. The afternoon sun streamed through my windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits bearing witness to the destruction of comfortable lies. I need some air, David said suddenly, pushing himself up from my recliner with the jerky movements of someone operating on autopilot. He walked to my sliding patio door and stepped onto the deck that overlooked my carefully maintained desert garden. Through the glass, I could see him gripping the railing as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Amanda remained at the table, but her attention had shifted completely from concerns about my memory to damage control calculations. I recognized the expression from years of watching her navigate hospital politics and family crises. She was already 3 steps ahead, planning how to contain the fallout from what I'd revealed. "Kids," she said with forced brightness, "why don't you go outside and play with Grandma's sprinkler system?" She was checking it last night, so maybe you can help make sure it's working properly. It was a transparent attempt to get Grace and Ben out of earshot for whatever confrontation was coming next. But Grace was too perceptive to be easily managed. I want to stay with Grandma, she said firmly, moving closer to where I stood by the stove. She's telling important stories. These aren't stories for children, Amanda replied, her voice carrying a sharp edge that made Ben look up from his blocks with worried eyes. Why not? Grace pressed with the relentless logic of childhood. If they're true things that happened to our family, why can't we know about them? The question hung in the air like a challenge to every assumption about what children should and shouldn't be told about family history. I found myself thinking about my own childhood, growing up in a house where adult secrets were whispered behind closed doors and children learned to piece together truth from fragments of overheard conversations. Because some truths are complicated, Amanda said, but her explanation sounded weak even to her own ears. Everything is complicated when you're 9, Grace replied with devastating simplicity. That doesn't mean people should lie to me about it. I felt a surge of pride in my granddaughter's wisdom, followed immediately by concern about the burden of truth she was asking to carry. At 9 years old, she was already demonstrating more emotional intelligence than many adults I knew, but that didn't mean she was ready for the full weight of family dysfunction. The kettle began to whistle, and I turned off the burner with deliberate slowness, buying myself time to think. Outside on the deck, David had pulled out his phone and was pacing back and forth while talking to someone in urgent, hushed tones. Probably his brother Marcus, who lived in Denver and had always been his closest confidant. Or maybe his therapist, Dr. Chen, who'd been helping him navigate work stress for the past year. Amanda, I said quietly, we need to talk. Alone. She looked at the children, then back at me, clearly torn between her desire to maintain control over the narrative and her recognition that some conversations required privacy. Grace, take Ben to the backyard and show him Grandma's cactus garden, she instructed. But stay where we can see you through the window. Grace opened her mouth to protest, but something in my expression must have convinced her this was one of those times when adult requests weren't really requests. Come on, Ben, she said, taking her little brother's hand. Let's go look at the plants that don't need much water. As the children headed outside, I poured hot water over tea bags and 2 mugs, choosing chamomile for its calming properties. Amanda and I would need all the help we could get to navigate what was coming next. How long have you known? Amanda asked as soon as the sliding door closed behind the children. I carried the mugs to the table and sat across from her, noting how her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her tea. About Marcus? Since the beginning. About your visits to Dr. Patterson? Since you started using my address for appointment reminders when you were worried David might see them in your mail. Her face went white. You've been opening my mail? I've been receiving mail addressed to Amanda Reeves at my address and returning it to the postal service marked incorrect address for 3 years. It took me exactly 1 phone call to Dr. Patterson's office to understand why someone would want their psychiatrist appointments to go to their mother-in-law's house instead of their own. The admission hit her like a physical blow. I watched her calculate how much I might know about her sessions with Dr. Patterson, what kind of information might have been contained in those appointment reminders, how many other people might have access to her private medical information. That's illegal, she said finally. Opening someone else's mail is a federal crime. So is adultery in some states, I replied mildly. But I'm not particularly interested in pressing charges about either offense. I'm more interested in understanding why my son's wife has been lying to everyone about where she goes twice a month. Amanda stared into her tea as if it might contain answers to questions she hadn't figured out how to ask yet. It's not what you think. What do I think? That I'm crazy. That I'm having some kind of breakdown that I'm hiding from David. I studied her face, noting the exhaustion that makeup couldn't quite conceal and the tension that had become so constant it seemed like a permanent part of her posture. Are you? The question was asked gently, but it clearly wasn't what she'd expected. She looked up from her tea with surprise that quickly shifted to something that might have been relief. I don't know, she admitted quietly. Maybe. The affair with Marcus happened because I felt like I was disappearing. Like I was just David's wife and the children's mother and the hospital administrator who solved everyone else's problems, but I wasn't anyone on my own anymore. It was the first completely honest thing she'd said since arriving at my house, and I felt some of my anger begin to shift towards something more complicated. Understanding, maybe, or at least recognition of feelings I'd experienced myself during the early years of my marriage to Robert. And Dr. Patterson? Depression, anxiety, what she calls a, quote, identity displacement disorder, which sounds like a fancy way of saying I don't know who I am anymore. Amanda's laugh held no humor. Turns out having an affair doesn't actually solve the problem of feeling invisible. It just adds guilt and secrecy to an already complicated emotional mess. Through the kitchen window, I could see Grace pointing out different types of cacti to Ben, while David continued his urgent phone conversation on the deck. The normal rhythm of family life continuing even as the foundation of that family shifted beneath our feet. Does David know about Dr. Patterson? He knows I see her. He thinks it's for work stress and parenting challenges. He doesn't know about the depression diagnosis or the medication, or the fact that I've been trying to figure out whether I want to stay married to him. Another bomb dropped quietly into our conversation. I sipped my tea and tried to process this new information alongside everything else I'd learned in the past hour. And what have you decided? I don't know that either. The affair made me realize that I'm not happy, but it didn't make me realize what would make me happy instead. Dr. Patterson says that's normal for people who've lost touch with their own identity, but it doesn't make it any easier to figure out what to do next. I thought about my own marriage to Robert, the way I'd sometimes felt lost in the role of wife and mother and community volunteer. But I'd also thought about the difference between feeling temporarily disconnected from yourself and feeling fundamentally unsure about whether you wanted the life you'd built. What does this have to do with your concerns about my memory? Amanda's face flushed red. We weren't trying to hurt you, Erica. David really is worried about some of the things that have been happening. But I think maybe I encouraged those worries because it was easier to focus on your problems than deal with my own. The admission was delivered quietly, but it carried the weight of recognition that felt like a turning point in our conversation. For the first time since she'd arrived at my house, Amanda was talking to me like an equal, rather than like someone who needed to be managed or controlled. So the memory evaluation? David's idea, but I supported it, because I thought if you were having cognitive issues, it would give us a reason to be more involved in your daily life, which would give me more opportunities to spend time somewhere other than my own house, with my own thoughts and my own problems. I set down my tea mug and looked directly at her. Amanda, using my supposed mental decline as an escape from your marriage problems is about the most manipulative thing I can imagine. I know. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I know, and I'm ashamed of it, and I don't know how to fix any of it. Outside, David had finished his phone call and was walking back toward the house with the determined stride of someone who'd reached some kind of decision. Through the sliding door, I could hear Grace explaining to Ben why desert plants needed less water than the grass that grew in other places. Life is about adaptation, she was saying with the seriousness of a much older child. Things that grow in the desert learn to be strong with less water, because that's what they have to work with. From the mouths of babes, indeed. My granddaughter had just articulated something that Amanda and I had been struggling to understand about marriage and family, and the work of building sustainable relationships. David stepped back into the house carrying whatever resolution he'd reached during his phone conversation. His face was calmer than it had been when he'd left, but his eyes held a new wariness that suggested he'd been processing more than just the immediate crisis. I called Dr. Chen, he announced without preamble. She's agreed to see all of us together for family counseling. Today, if possible. Amanda and I looked at each other, recognizing that the crisis had moved beyond private conversations and damage control into the realm of professional intervention. All of us? Amanda asked. You, me, Mom, and the kids if Dr. Chen thinks it's appropriate. We clearly have some serious communication issues that go way beyond concerns about memory problems. I felt a flutter of anxiety at the prospect of family therapy. At 72, I'd managed to navigate most of life's challenges without professional help, relying instead on common sense, life experience, and the occasional conversation with trusted friends like Patricia. But I also recognized that the secrets I'd revealed had created a situation too complex for any of us to handle alone. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "That we'd discovered some significant family issues that needed immediate attention, and that previous assumptions about the source of our problems had been incorrect." David looked at me with something that might have been respect. "I told her that you'd proven your memory was working perfectly well by revealing information that some family members would have preferred to keep private." It was a diplomatic way of describing the nuclear bomb I'd detonated in my living room, but it captured the essential facts without revealing details that weren't David's to share with his therapist. "And she can see us today?" "She had a cancellation at 4:30. It's almost 3 now, so we'd need to leave in about 30 minutes. David paused, looking between Amanda and me. "If you're both willing to do this." I thought about the alternative. We could all go home and pretend this conversation hadn't happened, retreat into our separate corners and hope that time would somehow heal the damage we'd inflicted on each other. But I'd lived long enough to know that some wounds only got worse when they weren't properly treated. "I'm willing," I said finally. Amanda nodded slowly. "Me too." David called the children back inside to explain that we'd be making an unexpected trip to see someone who helped families talk through problems. Grace accepted this information with the equanimity of a child who'd learned to roll with adult complications. But Ben needed more explanation about why everyone was suddenly so serious. "Are we in trouble?" he asked, looking around at the adult faces with the kind of concern that 5-year-olds reserve for situations they can't quite understand, but sense are important. "No, buddy," David said, kneeling down to Ben's level. "Sometimes families need help figuring out how to talk to each other better. It's like when you and Grace have a disagreement and you need a grown-up to help you work it out. But who helps grown-ups work it out? Other grown-ups who are really good at helping people solve problems." Ben considered this with the seriousness of a child processing new information about how the world works. "Like teachers, but for feelings?" "Exactly like teachers, but for feelings." As we prepared to leave for Dr. Chen's office, I found myself thinking about the question Ben had asked. Who helps grown-ups work out their problems? For most of my adult life, I'd assumed that grown-ups were supposed to figure things out on their own, that needing help was a sign of weakness or failure. But maybe that assumption had been part of the problem. Maybe the reason our family had accumulated so many secrets and resentments was that we'd all been trying to handle complicated emotional situations without the tools or support we actually needed. I gathered my purse and car keys, noting how the simple act of leaving my house felt different now than it had when David and Amanda first arrived. This morning, I'd been a woman whose family questioned her mental competence. Now I was a woman whose family was finally ready to acknowledge that their problems went much deeper than anyone's memory issues. The drive to Dr. Chen's office took 25 minutes through afternoon Phoenix traffic. David and Amanda rode in tense silence while Grace and Ben chattered in the back seat about the cacti they'd seen in my garden, and whether desert tortoises really lived to be 100 years old. I followed in my own car, using the time to think about what I wanted to say to a family therapist I'd never met about secrets I'd kept for decades. How do you explain to a stranger that you'd chosen silence over honesty for years because you'd believed it was kinder? How do you justify decisions that had seemed loving at the time but now looked like enablement of dysfunction? Dr. Chen's office was located in a professional building near the hospital where Amanda worked, a detail that made me wonder if Amanda had chosen David's therapist partially for the convenience of the location. The waiting room was decorated in soothing earth tones, with comfortable chairs and strategically placed tissue boxes that suggested emotional conversations were a regular occurrence. Grace immediately gravitated toward a bookshelf filled with children's books about feelings and family relationships. Ben found a basket of fidget toys and selected a small rubber ball that he began squeezing with the focused concentration he brought to activities that helped him process stress. When Dr. Chen emerged from her office to greet us, I was struck by her calm presence and kind eyes. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of professional warmth that suggested she'd had extensive experience helping families navigate crisis situations. "Mrs. Reeves," she said, extending her hand to me. "I'm Dr. Chen. David has told me wonderful things about you over the years." I shook her hand, wondering what kinds of wonderful things David had shared during his individual therapy sessions. Had he talked about his mother, who seemed to be developing memory problems? Or had he focused on other aspects of our relationship that had nothing to do with cognitive decline? Thank you for seeing us on such short notice, I replied. Family crises don't usually happen during regular business hours, she said with a smile that suggested she'd dealt with plenty of emergency sessions over the years. Her office was larger than the waiting room, but decorated with the same soothing color palette. A circle of chairs was arranged near the windows, and I noticed that the seating was designed to put everyone at the same level, rather than creating any sense of hierarchy between the therapist and her clients. Before we begin, Dr. Chen said as we settled into our chairs, I want to establish some ground rules for our conversation. First, everything discussed here is confidential, unless someone reveals information about immediate danger to themselves or others. Second, everyone gets to speak without interruption, and everyone's feelings are valid even when people disagree about facts. Third, the goal is understanding and problem-solving, not winning arguments or assigning blame. Grace raised her hand as if she were in school. What if someone says something that isn't true? Dr. Chen smiled at her directness. That's a great question, Grace. Sometimes people remember things differently, or they have different perspectives on the same events. Our job is to understand why people see things the way they do, not to decide who's right and who's wrong. It was a diplomatic answer, but I wondered how it would apply to the specific revelations I'd made about provable facts, like Amanda's affair or David's parentage. Some things weren't matters of perspective or interpretation. David, Dr. Chen continued, you mentioned on the phone that there had been some significant revelations about family history that changed your understanding of recent concerns. Would you like to start by sharing what brought you here today? David looked around the circle, his gaze settling on me with an expression I couldn't quite read. We came to Mom's house because we were worried about her memory. There had been some incidents that made us think she might be developing cognitive problems, and we wanted to talk to her about getting a professional evaluation. And what happened during that conversation? She proved that her memory works perfectly well by telling us things about our family that we didn't know she knew. Things that some of us wished she didn't know. Dr. Chen made a note on her tablet. How did that feel, learning that your concerns about your mother's memory might not be accurate? Confusing. Embarrassing, like we'd completely misunderstood the situation. David paused, looking at Amanda. And like maybe our concerns about Mom's behavior were really concerns about other things that we didn't want to deal with directly. It was the most honest assessment I'd heard from him all day, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe this family therapy session might actually lead to some kind of productive resolution. Amanda, Dr. Chen said, turning her attention to my daughter-in-law, how do you feel about what David just shared? Amanda's composure had returned during the drive to the office, but I could see the effort it was taking her to maintain it. I think we made some mistakes in how we interpreted Erica's behavior. And I think we let our own stress and problems influence how we saw situations that probably had simple explanations. It was a careful response that acknowledged error without revealing the specific nature of the problems that had influenced their judgment. Dr. Chen seemed to recognize the diplomatic language for what it was. It sounds like there might be some underlying family issues that contributed to the misunderstanding about memory concerns. Would anyone like to share more about what those issues might be? The question hung in the air like an invitation to either continue the revelations I'd started at my house, or retreat back into the comfortable lies we'd all been living with. I looked at my grandchildren, wondering how much truth they could handle, and how much protection they needed from adult complications. Dr. Chen, I said carefully, some of the information that came out today involves adult situations that might not be appropriate to discuss in front of the children. I can arrange for the children to spend some time in our family room with activities while the adults talk if that would be helpful. Grace and Ben, would you be comfortable playing in the next room for a little while? Grace looked around the circle of adults, clearly torn between her desire to know what was happening and her recognition that she was being offered a graceful exit from a conversation that was likely to become more complicated. Will you tell us later what you decided? She asked. We'll tell you anything that affects you directly, David promised. And we'll answer any questions you have that are appropriate for us to answer. It was a more honest response than the automatic everything's fine that adults usually gave children in crisis situations, and Grace seemed to accept it as a reasonable compromise. After the children were settled in the adjacent room with books and puzzles, the four remaining adults faced each other in the circle of chairs, with the weight of unfinished revelations pressing down on us like a storm front moving in from the desert. "Now," Dr. Chen said gently, "what are the adult situations that led to today's crisis?" I took a deep breath and began to explain about the secrets I'd been keeping, the lies I'd been protecting, and the way my family's dysfunction had been misinterpreted as my cognitive decline. With each revelation, I watched David and Amanda process information that reshapes their understanding not just of our family history, but of the present crisis that had brought us to this office. By the time I finished, the afternoon sun was slanting low through Dr. Chen's windows, and we were all sitting in a circle of emotional wreckage that would require much more than one therapy session to clean up. But for the first time in years, we were also sitting in a circle of truth. And maybe, I thought, that was where healing had to begin. Dr. Chen's office felt different after my revelations settled into the space between us like smoke from a fire that had finally burned through years of accumulated debris. The silence stretched long enough for me to hear the distant sounds of Grace and Ben playing in the adjacent room, their innocent laughter a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere we adults had created. "Erica," Dr. Chen said finally, her voice carrying the measured calm of someone who'd heard similar stories many times before, "it sounds like you've been carrying the emotional weight of this family's secrets for a very long time." I nodded, surprised by how exhausted I felt now that the truth was finally out in the open. For decades, keeping those secrets had felt like a burden I was strong enough to bear. Only now, having set them down, did I realize how much energy it had taken to carry them. "The question I have," she continued, "is what you hoped to accomplish by revealing them today." It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since the words had started pouring out of me in my living room. I wanted to prove that there was nothing wrong with my memory. They were so convinced I was losing my mind that they couldn't see their own problems clearly. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mom, we weren't trying to attack you. We were genuinely worried." "Were you? Or were you looking for a convenient explanation for why your family was falling apart?" The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but they carried a truth that needed to be spoken. Sometimes concern could become a form of denial, a way of focusing on someone else's problems to avoid confronting your own. Dr. Chen made a note on her tablet. "David, how do you feel about your mother's suggestion that your concerns about her memory might have been influenced by other family stresses?" "Confused," he admitted. "I mean, she did forget Amanda's birthday. She did show up to Grace's play on the wrong night. Those things actually happened. But now you're learning that there might have been other explanations for those behaviors?" "Yeah, and that makes me question my judgment about everything else." David looked at Amanda, then back at me. "If I was wrong about Mom's memory problems, what else have I been wrong about?" It was the question of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had been challenged, and I felt a stab of guilt for being the one who'd forced him to ask it. But I also felt relief that he was finally willing to examine his own perceptions instead of simply accepting them as fact. Amanda had been silent since we'd entered Dr. Chen's office, but now she spoke with the careful tone of someone choosing her words deliberately. "I think I need to take responsibility for encouraging David's concerns about Erica's memory. I was dealing with my own issues, and it was easier to focus on problems that seemed external to our marriage." "Can you say more about that?" Amanda glanced at me, and I saw her calculating how much she was willing to reveal in front of David and a therapist she'd just met. "I've been struggling with depression and identity issues for several years. I started seeing Dr. Patterson about 3 years ago, but I didn't want David to know how serious it was." David's head snapped toward his wife with an expression of shock that suggested this was the first time he'd heard her mental health struggles described in clinical terms. "You said you were seeing her for work stress." I was lying. I've been lying about a lot of things because I didn't know how to explain that I was falling apart without making you feel like it was your fault. The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge neither of them knew how to cross. I watched David process this information alongside everything else he'd learned about his wife's secret life over the past few hours. "What else have you been lying about?" he asked quietly. Amanda looked at Dr. Chen as if seeking permission to reveal information that would fundamentally change her marriage. I had an affair 5 years ago with someone from your office. It lasted about 6 months, and I ended it because I realized it wasn't solving any of my real problems. The words hit David like physical blows. I watched his face cycle through disbelief, hurt, anger, and something that might have been relief that the vague sense of distance he'd been feeling finally had an explanation. Marcus, he said flatly. It was Marcus Thompson. Amanda nodded, tears beginning to stream down her face. I'm sorry, David. I'm so sorry for all of it. Dr. Chen let the silence stretch for a long moment before speaking. This is clearly very painful information for both of you to share and receive. David, how are you feeling right now? Like my entire life has been a lie, he said without hesitation. Like I don't know who my wife is, who my mother is, who I am. Everything I thought I understood about my family was apparently wrong. I felt the weight of responsibility for his pain settle onto my shoulders like a heavy coat. By revealing the secrets I'd been keeping, I'd forced him to confront truths he hadn't been prepared to handle. But I'd also given him the opportunity to finally understand why his life had felt unstable and confusing for years. David, I said gently, you are exactly who you've always been. You're a good father, a hard worker, a man who cares deeply about his family. The fact that some people in your life have been keeping secrets doesn't change your fundamental character. But how can I trust any of it? How can I trust any of you? It was the essential question that would determine whether our family could heal from this crisis or whether the revelations would destroy us completely. Trust, once broken, required deliberate effort to rebuild, and I wasn't sure any of us had the energy or skill for that kind of emotional construction project. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. David, that's a completely understandable response to learning that important people in your life have been withholding significant information. The question is whether you want to work toward rebuilding trust, or whether you feel like the foundation is too damaged to repair. I don't know, he said honestly. Right now I just feel angry and hurt and confused. Those are all appropriate feelings given what you've just learned. Amanda, how are you feeling about David's response? Terrified, Amanda admitted. Terrified that I've destroyed our marriage and our family by keeping secrets. Terrified that the depression and anxiety I've been trying to manage on my own has made me into someone who lies to the people I love most. I found myself thinking about the early years of my marriage to Robert, when I'd struggled with my own sense of identity and purpose. I'd never had an affair, but I'd certainly felt the temptation to escape into fantasies of different lives and different choices. The difference was that I'd had Robert to talk to about those feelings, and Amanda had apparently felt like she needed to handle everything alone. Amanda, I said carefully, depression can make people feel like they're drowning, and that asking for help will just pull other people under with them. But isolation usually makes the depression worse, not better. She looked at me with surprise, as if she hadn't expected understanding from the person whose trust she'd violated by lying about her mental health treatment. Dr. Patterson said something similar. She said that depression often convinces people that they're protecting others by hiding their struggles, but that secrecy usually damages relationships more than honesty would. Why didn't you feel like you could tell David about what you were going through? Because he was already stressed about work and money, and I didn't want to add my problems to his load. And because I was ashamed that I couldn't just be happy with the life we'd built together. David had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention of someone trying to piece together a puzzle from fragments he'd never noticed before. I wish you'd told me, he said finally. I wish you'd trusted me enough to let me help. I wish I had too, but I was so deep in my own head that I couldn't see past my own pain to realize that keeping secrets was hurting you too. Dr. Chen made more notes, then looked around the circle of chairs where we sat like survivors of some emotional natural disaster. It sounds like this family has been struggling with communication patterns that prioritize protection over honesty. Erica, you kept secrets to protect David from painful truths about his parentage and Amanda's behavior. Amanda, you kept secrets to protect David from your mental health struggles and poor choices. But those protective secrets created distance and mistrust, that ultimately caused more pain than the original truths might have. I felt the accuracy of her assessment like a diagnosis I didn't want to accept but couldn't argue with. My intention had been to spare my family pain, but my methods had created a different kind of suffering that was arguably worse than the truth would have been. So what do we do now? I asked. Now you decide whether you want to rebuild your relationships on a foundation of honesty, with all the discomfort that requires, or whether you want to continue with the patterns that brought you to this crisis point. It wasn't really a choice when she put it that way. We'd already proven that secrecy and protective lies led to dysfunction and mistrust. But the prospect of complete honesty felt overwhelming, especially given how much damage the truth had already caused in just one afternoon. David spoke first. I want to try rebuilding with honesty, but I need time to process all of this before I can figure out what that looks like practically. Amanda nodded through her tears. I want that too. And I want to get better help for my depression so that I'm not making decisions based on fear and shame anymore. They both looked at me expectantly, waiting for my commitment to this new approach to family relationships. I want honesty too, I said finally, but I also want to learn how to be honest in ways that build people up instead of tearing them down. I think my delivery today could have been kinder. Dr. Chen smiled for the first time since we'd entered her office. Those are all excellent starting points, but rebuilding trust and changing communication patterns takes time and practice. Are you all willing to commit to regular family therapy sessions while you work through these issues? The prospect of weekly therapy sessions felt daunting, but I recognized that the alternative was watching our family disintegrate under the weight of revealed secrets and damaged trust. Yes, I said. David and Amanda nodded their agreement, though I could see the exhaustion in both their faces. Emotional honesty was harder work than any of us had anticipated. Good. I'm going to give each of you some homework for this week, individual assignments that will help you prepare for our next session together. She turned to me first. Erica, I want you to write about your decision-making process around keeping family secrets. Not just what you kept hidden, but why you made those choices, and how they felt to you over time. I want you to explore whether there were moments when you considered revealing the truth and what stopped you. The assignment felt simultaneously easy and impossible. Easy, because I remembered every decision clearly. Impossible, because examining my motivations might reveal things about myself I wasn't ready to confront. David, I want you to write about your experience of learning these family secrets. Focus on your feelings rather than trying to analyze or judge anyone's behavior. What emotions came up for you? What fears do you have about moving forward? What hopes do you have for your relationships? David nodded, though I could see him already organizing his thoughts into the logical frameworks he used for work problems. Learning to focus on feelings instead of solutions would be a challenge for him. Amanda, I want you to explore your decision to reveal your mental health struggles and extramarital affair in this setting. What made you feel safe enough to tell the truth today? What fears do you have about David's reaction? What kind of support do you need as you work on your depression? Amanda was crying again, but it was a different kind of tears than she'd shed earlier. These seemed more like relief than despair, as if the prospect of finally being honest about her struggles felt liberating despite the pain it had caused. All of you, Dr. Chen continued, should be prepared to discuss what healthy boundaries look like in your relationships. How do you support each other without enabling dysfunction? How do you maintain privacy without keeping destructive secrets? How do you handle information that might hurt someone you love? As we prepared to leave Dr. Chen's office, I felt like we were emerging from surgery. The operation had been necessary to save the patient, but the recovery period was going to be long and painful. Grace and Ben rejoined us from the family room, their faces bright with the enthusiasm children bring to new experiences. Did you solve all the problems? Grace asked with the optimism of someone who believed adults could fix anything given enough time and professional help. We're learning how to solve them, David said carefully. It's going to take some time and work. Like how I learned to ride my bike? Ben asked. Where I had to practice a lot and fall down sometimes? Exactly like that, Amanda said, her voice still hoarse from crying but steadier than it had been all afternoon. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts about the homework assignments and the changes we'd committed to making. I followed David and Amanda's car through the familiar streets of Phoenix, watching the late afternoon sun paint the desert landscape in shades of gold and orange. At home, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and a blank notebook, staring at the assignment Dr. Chen had given me. Writing about my decision-making process around family secrets meant examining decades of choices I'd made with the best intentions but questionable results. I started with David's parentage, trying to trace the evolution of a lie that had begun as protection and hardened into fundamental deception over time. Robert and I had told David his biological father was dead because the truth, that he was violent and unstable and had abandoned us, seemed crueler than a fabricated story about loss. But protecting a 2-year-old from painful truth was different from lying to a 35-year-old man about his own history. Somewhere along the way, our protective story had become a prison that trapped all of us in roles we'd outgrown. I wrote about Amanda's affair, about the night I'd discovered the hotel receipt in her car and the choice I'd made to confront her privately rather than telling David immediately. She'd begged me to keep her secret while she figured out how to end the relationship and fix her marriage, and I'd agreed because I'd believed families should have opportunities to heal their own wounds. But my silence had enabled her to continue the affair for months longer than she might have otherwise. My protection had become complicity, and my discretion had become a form of emotional manipulation that gave me power over other people's relationships. The hardest part to write about was my own motivation. Why had I chosen secrecy over honesty so consistently? Part of it was genuine love and desire to protect people from pain. But part of it was also control, the satisfaction of being the person who knew everyone's truth and could manage the family's emotional well-being through careful information management. I'd become the keeper of secrets because it made me feel valuable and needed. People confided in me because they trusted my discretion, and I'd enjoyed that role even when it required me to lie to other people I loved. By the time I finished writing, it was nearly midnight, and my hand was cramped from hours of continuous composition. But I'd filled 23 pages with honest reflection about choices I'd never examined so carefully before. The next morning, Patricia called to check on me after hearing from neighbors that I'd had family visitors the day before. Phoenix was a big city, but our particular neighborhood retained the small-town quality where people noticed unusual activity and checked on each other's welfare. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked with the tone of someone prepared to offer help or casseroles, depending on the nature of the crisis. "It's complicated," I said, realizing that honest communication was going to require practice, even in casual conversations. We had some family issues that needed to be addressed. "Anything I can help with?" I thought about Patricia's tendency to dramatize situations and share neighborhood news with anyone who would listen. Under normal circumstances, I would have deflected her curiosity with vague reassurances and changed the subject, but I was supposed to be practicing honesty. "We're working through some problems with the help of a family therapist. Nothing dangerous or scandalous, just relationship issues that got complicated over time." It was more information than I'd ever shared with Patricia about family problems, but it was also honest without being inappropriately detailed. She seemed satisfied with the explanation and moved on to other neighborhood gossip without pressing for more details. The week passed slowly as I worked on my therapy homework and tried to implement small changes in how I communicated with the people around me. When the clerk at the grocery store asked how I was doing, I said struggling with some family issues but hopeful they'll improve, instead of my automatic, "Fine, thank you." When my book club members asked about my week, I mentioned that I was seeing a family therapist without elaborating on the specific problems we were addressing. Each small act of honesty felt like a tiny revolution against decades of automatic privacy and diplomatic deflection. I was learning to tell the truth without telling everything, to be genuine without being inappropriate. David called twice during the week, conversations that felt stilted and careful as we both navigated new territory. He'd started his own individual therapy sessions with Dr. Chen and was working through his feelings about the family revelations. He sounded exhausted but determined, like someone committed to a difficult process despite the emotional cost. Amanda sent me a handwritten letter, delivered by David but written in her careful script on cream-colored stationery. She apologized for the lies and manipulation, thanked me for keeping her secrets even when it cost me my family's trust in my mental competence, and asked if we could find a way to rebuild our relationship on more honest foundations. The letter felt like an attempt to practice the kind of communication we'd committed to in Dr. Chen's office, and I appreciated the effort even though forgiveness would take more time than a single week could provide. By the time our second family therapy session arrived, I felt like I'd been through an intensive course in emotional archaeology, digging up buried feelings and examining them in the harsh light of honest self-reflection. The homework had been more difficult than I'd expected, forcing me to confront my own motivations and acknowledge my role in creating the family dysfunction I'd spent years trying to manage. Walking into Dr. Chen's office for the second time, I felt nervous in a way I hadn't experienced the week before. The first session had been about crisis management and immediate damage control. This session was about the harder work of actually changing patterns that had been decades in the making, but I also felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope that my family might finally learn to love each other honestly instead of protecting each other dishonestly. It was a fragile hope, easily damaged by setbacks or resistance. But it was real, and it was mine, and I was determined to nurture it through whatever difficult work lay ahead. 6 weeks after our first family therapy session, I stood in my kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, watching the sunrise paint the desert sky in brilliant shades of coral and gold. The automatic coffee maker gurgled to life, a sound that had become part of my new morning routine since I'd started waking earlier to spend time journaling before the day's activities began. Dr. Chen had suggested daily writing as a way to process the emotional work we were doing in therapy, and I'd discovered that the quiet hours before dawn were perfect for honest self-reflection. This morning I was writing about the small but significant changes I'd noticed in our family dynamics over the past month and a half. David had been calling me every Tuesday evening not because there was a crisis or emergency, but simply to maintain regular contact. These conversations were different from our previous interactions, more genuine and less performative. He asked about my volunteer work at the senior center, shared updates about his therapy sessions, and occasionally mentioned memories from his childhood that he was reprocessing in light of what he'd learned about his biological father. Last week, he'd asked me directly about the man who'd contributed to his genetics but never participated in raising him. "What was he really like, Mom?" "Not the sanitized version you and Dad gave me, but the truth." I'd found myself describing someone who'd been charming and intelligent when he wasn't drinking, but who became unpredictable and frightening when alcohol amplified his existing mental health issues. I'd explained how Robert had stepped into the father role not out of obligation but out of genuine love for both David and me, and how the legal adoption had been Robert's idea because he'd wanted David to carry his name and inherit his legacy. "He saved us," I'd told David honestly. "Your biological father might have given you life, but Robert gave you the tools to build something meaningful with that life." The conversation had lasted over an hour, and when we'd hung up, I'd felt the satisfaction that comes from finally telling the complete truth about something that had been partially hidden for decades. Amanda had been working with Dr. Patterson to address her depression more aggressively, including medication adjustments and intensive therapy sessions twice a week. She'd also started attending a support group for people dealing with identity issues related to major life transitions. The changes in her were subtle but noticeable. She seemed more present during family gatherings, less anxious about perfection, more willing to ask for help when she needed it. 3 weeks ago, she'd called me directly to ask if I would be willing to attend one of her therapy sessions with Dr. Patterson to discuss our relationship and the impact of the secrets I'd kept on her behalf. "I want to understand how my behavior affected you," she'd said. "And I want to figure out how we can rebuild trust between us without putting you in the position of keeping my secrets again." The session with Dr. Patterson had been illuminating in ways I hadn't expected. Amanda had revealed that her affair with Marcus had been motivated partly by a desire to feel special and chosen, emotions she'd been lacking in her marriage as depression made everything feel gray and meaningless. But she'd also admitted that involving me in her secret-keeping had been a form of emotional manipulation, using my discretion to avoid accountability for her choices. "I knew you wouldn't tell David because you never told family secrets," she'd explained to Dr. Patterson, while I sat in the uncomfortable position of hearing my own patterns described from someone else's perspective. "I counted on your loyalty to protect me from consequences I deserved to face." Dr. Patterson had helped us discuss how I could support Amanda's recovery without enabling future poor decisions, and how Amanda could rebuild my trust without putting me in impossible positions. It was delicate work, requiring both of us to examine our motivations and change behaviors that had become automatic over years of practice. The children had been showing their own signs of adjustment to our family's new commitment to honesty. Grace had started asking more direct questions about adult situations instead of trying to piece together information from overheard conversations. Last week, she'd asked me straightforwardly whether David and Amanda were going to get divorced. "I don't know, sweetheart," I'd told her honestly. "They're working very hard to rebuild their marriage, but that's a decision only they can make." "Are you still mad at Mommy for lying to you?" The question had required me to think carefully about the difference between anger and disappointment, between holding people accountable and holding grudges. "I'm not mad anymore, but I'm still learning to trust her again. When someone lies to you, even for reasons they think are good, it takes time to feel safe believing them again." Grace had nodded with the seriousness she brought to important conversations, like when Ben broke my art project and said the cat did it. "I forgave him, but I still put my special things where he can't reach them now." The wisdom of a 9-year-old, translating complex adult emotional concepts into practical life management strategies. Children often understood instinctively what adults struggled to learn through therapy. Forgiveness didn't require the elimination of appropriate protective boundaries. Ben had been less verbal about the family changes, but I'd noticed him watching adult conversations more carefully, as if he were learning to read emotional undercurrents he'd previously missed. He'd also started asking me to tell him stories about the old days when I was young, perhaps seeking reassurance that family history could be trusted, and that the adults in his life had foundation stories that were solid and reliable. This morning, as I finished my coffee and prepared for another day of the careful work required to rebuild family relationships, my phone rang with David's number displayed on the screen. It was unusual for him to call so early, and I felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that came with unexpected contact during non-routine hours. "Good morning, sweetheart," I answered, keeping my voice calm despite my concern. "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it from someone else." The serious tone in his voice triggered every maternal alarm system I possessed, but I'd learned to wait for information before jumping to conclusions. "What's going on? Amanda and I have decided to separate for a while. Not divorce, but we need some space to work on our individual issues before we can figure out whether we can rebuild our marriage." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, processing this information and its implications for everyone involved. "How are you both feeling about this decision?" "Scared, but also relieved. We've been trying so hard to fix everything all at once that we haven't been giving ourselves room to actually heal from the damage that's been done." Dr. Chen suggested that some couples benefit from temporary separation while they work on individual therapy goals. It was a mature response that suggested both David and Amanda were taking professional advice seriously, rather than making impulsive decisions based on hurt feelings or anger. "What does this mean practically? Where will you live? What about Grace and Ben?" "I'm moving into a furnished apartment downtown for 6 months. We'll split custody evenly, and we're both committed to maintaining as much stability as possible for the kids. Amanda will stay in the house, and I'll have Grace and Ben every other week." I thought about my grandchildren, who had already been processing significant changes in family dynamics, now being asked to adapt to their parents living separately. "How are Grace and Ben handling this news?" "Better than we expected, actually." Grace asked a lot of questions about logistics, and Ben wanted to know if he could decorate my new apartment. We were honest with them about needing to work on our individual problems, and they seemed to understand that sometimes fixing things requires taking them apart temporarily. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, as David explained the practical arrangements they'd made and the ways they planned to minimize disruption to the children's routines. When we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen feeling the familiar weight of family crisis, but also recognizing that this felt different from previous emergencies. This time, David and Amanda were making decisions based on professional guidance and long-term healing rather than immediate crisis management. They were being honest with their children about the situation, instead of trying to maintain pretenses that everyone could see through. Most importantly, they were taking responsibility for their individual contributions to the marriage problems instead of blaming external circumstances or other people. An hour later, Amanda called with her own version of the separation news. Her voice was steadier than I'd expected, suggesting that this decision had been carefully considered rather than made in anger or desperation. "I wanted you to know that this isn't about giving up on our marriage," she said. "It's about creating space for both of us to work on the personal issues that were damaging our relationship. I need to get my depression and identity issues under better control before I can be a good partner to anyone. How can I support you and the children during this transition? Honestly? Just continue being the grandmother you've always been, but with the new level of honesty we've been building. Grace and Ben are going to need stability and truthfulness from the adults in their lives while David and I figure out our own paths." It was a request that felt both familiar and revolutionary. I'd always been actively involved in my grandchildren's lives, but now that involvement would happen in the context of our family's commitment to honest communication rather than protective secrecy. 2 weeks later, the first real test of our new family dynamics arrived in the form of Grace's school science fair project. She'd chosen to research desert adaptation strategies in plants and animals, a topic that required significant adult support for library research and experiment design. In previous years, this kind of school project would have triggered elaborate coordination between multiple adults, with everyone contributing according to their strengths and availability. But now, with David and Amanda living separately, and our family still rebuilding trust and communication patterns, the logistics became more complicated. Grace called me on a Wednesday evening, her voice carrying the particular stress that elementary school students experience when big projects feel overwhelming. "Grandma, I need help with my science fair project, but Mom is working late and Dad is at his apartment and I don't know who to ask." The situation would have been a perfect opportunity for me to step in as the family crisis manager, coordinating schedules and resources to ensure Grace got the support she needed. But our work in family therapy had taught me to be more thoughtful about when helping was appropriate, and when it might enable other people to avoid their own responsibilities. "Have you talked to your parents about needing help with the project?" "I tried, but they're both really busy, and they keep saying they'll help me later, but later never comes." I felt the familiar surge of protective anger on Grace's behalf, followed immediately by the recognition that this was exactly the kind of situation where my impulse to fix everything could interfere with David and Amanda learning to navigate their new co-parenting responsibilities. "Grace, I'm happy to help you with your project, but I think your parents need to know that you're feeling unsupported. Would you like me to call them and explain what you need? Could you? I don't want them to think I'm complaining, but I really do need help, and the project is due in 2 weeks." I called David first, explaining Grace's situation and her need for adult guidance with research and experiment design. His response was immediate and appropriately guilty. "You're absolutely right, Mom. I've been so focused on managing the logistics of living in 2 places that I haven't been paying enough attention to the kids' school needs. Can I pick Grace up this evening and work on the project with her at my apartment?" When I called Amanda with the same information, she had a similar response of recognition and responsibility. "I've been staying late at work because it's easier than coming home to an empty house. But that's not fair to Grace and Ben. I'll leave the office early tomorrow and take Grace to the library to start her research." The science fair project became an opportunity for David and Amanda to practice coordinated co-parenting despite their separation. They divided the work according to their strengths. Amanda handled the research phase because of her organizational skills. David managed the experiment design because of his engineering background, and I provided backup support and encouragement without taking over the entire project. Grace's presentation 2 weeks later was excellent, but more importantly, she'd experienced her parents working together effectively to support her academic goals, despite their personal relationship challenges. She'd learned that family structures could change without eliminating parental responsibility or love. The success of the science fair project seemed to give David and Amanda confidence in their ability to navigate other challenges that arose during their separation period. When Ben came down with strep throat and needed someone to stay home with him for several days, they coordinated coverage without drama or resentment. When Grace wanted to invite friends over for her birthday party, they planned the celebration together and both attended despite their living arrangements. I found myself in a new role during this period, offering support and stability for my grandchildren, while respecting the boundaries David and Amanda had established around their individual healing processes. It required more delicate navigation than my previous approach of simply stepping in to solve whatever problems arose, but it also felt more sustainable and respectful of everyone's autonomy. 6 weeks into David and Amanda's separation, Dr. Chen scheduled a family therapy session to assess our progress and discuss how the temporary living arrangement was affecting everyone's emotional work. "How has this period of separation felt for each of you?" she asked as we settled into the familiar circle of chairs in her office. David spoke first. "Lonely, but also clarifying. Living alone has forced me to confront some of my own patterns that I was able to ignore when Amanda was handling all the household management. I've realized how much I was depending on her to manage my emotional life, as well as the practical details of family organization." Amanda nodded. "Similar for me. Without David there to focus on or blame for relationship problems, I've had to face my depression and anxiety more directly. It's been hard, but I think I'm finally making real progress in therapy instead of just talking about problems without changing anything." Grace and Ben had joined us for this session, and Dr. Chen turned her attention to them with the same seriousness she brought to adult concerns. "Grace, how has it felt having your parents live in different places?" "Confusing at first, but not as scary as I thought it would be. They're both still my parents, and they're both still taking care of me and Ben. It's just more complicated to keep track of which house we're supposed to be at." "Ben, what do you think about having two homes?" Ben, now comfortable with Dr. Chen after several family sessions, responded with 5-year-old directness. "I like Dad's apartment because it has a pool, but I like Mom's house because my toys are there. I wish they could both live in the same place again, but if they can't, that's okay too." Dr. Chen made notes about the children's adaptation before turning to me. "Erica, how has this family transition affected your role as grandmother?" "It's required me to be more intentional about when and how I offer support. I've had to learn the difference between helping in ways that strengthen the family system and helping in ways that enable other people to avoid their responsibilities." It was an honest assessment of the growth I'd been working toward, but it also revealed how much effort it took to maintain these new patterns. My instinct was still to step in and manage crises, and it required constant conscious choice to support without controlling. "What do you see as the biggest changes in your family's communication patterns since we started working together?" David answered first. "We're actually talking about problems instead of pretending they don't exist. It's more uncomfortable in the short term, but it feels more honest and sustainable. We're asking for help when we need it, instead of suffering in silence," Amanda added. "And we're accepting that sometimes help looks different than we expected." I thought about the question in the context of my own 72 years of life experience. We're learning that love doesn't require us to protect each other from all discomfort. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is tell someone a truth they need to hear, even when it's difficult. Dr. Chen smiled, the first completely relaxed expression I'd seen from her since we'd started family therapy. "Those are significant insights that suggest you're developing healthier relationship patterns. The question now is whether you're ready to start planning for David and Amanda's eventual reunion, or whether you need more time working on individual growth." David and Amanda looked at each other across the circle of chairs, and I saw a moment of wordless communication that reminded me of the early days of their marriage when they'd been genuinely connected partners. "I think we're ready to start planning," Amanda said quietly. "But slowly and carefully," David added, "with continued therapy support and clear agreements about how we want to rebuild our marriage differently than it was before." As we left Dr. Chen's office that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: optimism about my family's future. Not naive hope that ignored the work still ahead, but realistic confidence that we were all committed to continuing the difficult process of building honest, sustainable relationships. The desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples as we walked to our cars, and Grace slipped her hand into mine with the natural affection that had somehow survived all the adult complications and revelations. "Grandma," she said as David unlocked his car, "I'm glad you told us all those secrets, even though it made everything complicated for a while." "Why is that, sweetheart?" "Because now I know that grown-ups can tell the truth about hard things and still love each other. That seems important to know." I squeezed her hand gently, thinking about the wisdom that children could offer when adults were brave enough to include them in age-appropriate versions of family truth-telling. "It is important to know," I agreed. "And it's something I'm still learning how to do well." As I drove home through the familiar streets of Phoenix, I reflected on how much had changed since that afternoon 6 weeks ago, when David and Amanda had come to my house to discuss their concerns about my memory. The crisis that had brought us to family therapy had revealed problems that went much deeper than anyone's cognitive function. But it had also created opportunities for healing that wouldn't have existed if we'd continued avoiding difficult truths. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as we continued the work of rebuilding trust and maintaining honest communication. But tonight, I felt grateful for a family that was finally learning to love each other well enough to tell the truth. 1 year after the afternoon that changed everything, I stood in my backyard watching David and Amanda work together to hang birthday decorations for Ben's 6th birthday party. The Arizona sun filtered through the Palo Verde trees I'd planted decades ago with Robert, casting dancing shadows across the patio where 3 generations of our family would soon gather to celebrate. The sight of my son and daughter-in-law collaborating without tension or underlying resentment still felt miraculous to me, even though they'd been successfully co-parenting for months and had recently begun discussing moving back in together. Their 8-month separation had accomplished what Dr. Chen had hoped. Both had developed stronger individual identities and healthier coping mechanisms that made them better partners to each other. Amanda looked genuinely happy for the first time in years, her depression managed through a combination of medication, therapy, and lifestyle changes that included regular exercise and a part-time work schedule that gave her more time for personal interests. She'd started painting again, something she'd abandoned after Grace was born, and her artwork now decorated both her house and David's apartment with splashes of color that reflected her renewed sense of creativity and purpose. David had used his time living alone to develop domestic skills he'd never needed to learn, and to process his feelings about family history through individual therapy sessions that complemented our ongoing family work with Dr. Chen. He'd also reconnected with old friendships that had been neglected during the years when our family's dysfunction had consumed most of his emotional energy. "Grandma, can you help me with this banner?" Grace called from where she was attempting to string letters across 2 lawn chairs. At 10 years old, she'd grown taller and more confident, but she still sought adult collaboration for projects that required more coordination than she could manage alone. I walked over to help her, noting how naturally she asked for assistance when she needed it, rather than struggling in silence or expecting adults to anticipate her needs. Our family's commitment to direct communication had taught all of us, including the children, that asking for help was a sign of wisdom rather than weakness. "How's that?" I asked as we stretched the Happy Birthday Ben banner between 2 posts. "Perfect. Do you think he'll be surprised that we remembered he wanted a dinosaur theme this year?" Ben had been very specific about his birthday preferences, discussing them with anyone who would listen for the past month. His enthusiasm for paleontology had been encouraged by both parents and had resulted in several family trips to museums and fossil sites that gave David and Amanda opportunities to practice co-parenting in fun, low-stress environments. "I think he'll be thrilled," I said honestly. As if summoned by our conversation, Ben burst through the sliding door from the kitchen, wearing a t-shirt decorated with various dinosaur species and carrying a plastic triceratops that had become his constant companion. "Is everything ready? Are people coming soon? Did someone remember to get the cake with the T-Rex on it?" His rapid-fire questions reflected the excitement of a child who'd learned that the adults in his life could be trusted to follow through on promises and remember details that mattered to him. The reliability we'd built over the past year had given both children a sense of security that allowed them to be fully present in their own experiences rather than worrying about adult problems. "Everything is ready. People will start arriving in about an hour. And yes, the cake is exactly what you requested," Amanda assured him with the patient tone of someone who'd answered these questions multiple times already. The first guests began arriving as the afternoon sun started its descent toward the desert horizon. My neighbor Patricia came early to help with final preparations, bringing a homemade gift that reflected her growing friendship with Grace, who'd been teaching her watercolor techniques during their regular afternoon visits. "How are things going with the family situation?" Patricia asked quietly as we arranged plates and napkins on the outdoor tables. It was a question she'd been asking regularly over the past year, watching our family navigate therapy and separation and gradual healing with the concerned attention of someone who'd become genuinely invested in our well-being. "Better than I dared to hope," I told her honestly. "Not perfect, but much more honest and sustainable than what we had before." Dr. Chen arrived with her own family, something that would have seemed strange a year ago but now felt natural given how much time spent working together. Her twin daughters, who were Grace's age, had become friends during family therapy sessions that included children, and the professional relationship had evolved into something more personal without compromising the therapeutic work. "Erica," she said as her daughters ran off to find Grace and Ben, "I wanted you to know how much I've enjoyed watching your family's progress. The work you've all done to rebuild trust and communication has been remarkable. I thought about the year of therapy sessions, individual homework assignments, and careful practice of new relationship patterns that had brought us to this point. It wasn't work I knew I needed to do until the crisis forced me to examine my own patterns. That's often how growth happens. Sometimes it takes a breakdown to create space for a breakthrough." As the party continued around us, I found myself reflecting on the changes that had occurred, not just in my family relationships, but in my own sense of identity and purpose. The volunteer work I'd started at the senior center had expanded into teaching workshops about family communication and boundary setting, sharing what I'd learned through our therapeutic process with other older adults facing similar challenges with adult children. The work felt meaningful in ways that my previous family caretaking hadn't, because it was based on choice rather than obligation, and because it used my experiences to help others rather than simply managing crises as they arose. I discovered that my years of secret keeping and family management had given me insights that could be valuable to other people when shared openly rather than used as private manipulation tools. "Speech time," David announced as Ben's friends and family gathered around the birthday cake that did indeed feature an elaborate T-Rex design. Ben stood on a chair so everyone could see him, his face glowing with the confidence of a child who knew he was genuinely celebrated by the people who mattered most to him. "Thank you everyone for coming to my dinosaur party," he said with the formal tone children use for public speaking. "I'm 6 now, which means I'm old enough to learn about all the different periods when dinosaurs lived, and I'm excited about that." The simple speech was followed by enthusiastic applause and the traditional birthday song, but I found myself focusing on the underlying message Ben had unconsciously delivered. He was excited about learning and growing, confident that the adults in his life would support his interests and curiosity. That confidence was perhaps the greatest gift our family's healing process had given him. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, I helped clean up with the easy coordination that had developed between David, Amanda, and me over months of practicing respectful collaboration. We worked together efficiently without anyone taking control or directing the others, each contributing according to our abilities and availability. "Mom," David said as we folded the last of the chairs, "Amanda and I have been talking about something we'd like to discuss with you." I felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, but it was tempered by the trust we'd built through a year of honest communication. Whatever they wanted to discuss, I was confident it would be presented openly rather than through manipulation or crisis management. "We're planning to move back in together next month," Amanda said, "and we wanted to make sure you felt comfortable with how we've restructured our relationship and our approach to family dynamics." It was a request for blessing rather than permission, recognition that my opinion mattered without giving me veto power over their decisions. The distinction felt important, reflecting the healthier boundaries we'd all learned to maintain. "How do you both feel about taking that step?" "Ready," David said without hesitation. "Not because we've solved every problem, or because we'll never have conflicts again, but because we've learned how to handle problems when they arise. And we've both done the individual work necessary to be good partners to each other," Amanda added. "The separation gave us space to figure out who we are as individuals, and now we want to see if we can build something together that's based on those healthier identities." I looked at my son and daughter-in-law, noting the calm confidence in their expressions and the easy physical proximity that suggested genuine affection rather than performed compatibility. "I think you're both ready too," I said, "and I'm grateful that you've included me in this process instead of handling it privately and hoping I'd adjust to whatever you decided." As the sun set over the desert landscape that had been my home for nearly 4 decades, I stood in my backyard surrounded by family members who'd learned to love each other honestly, rather than protecting each other through secrecy and manipulation. Grace and Ben played with the dinosaur toys they'd received as gifts, their laughter mixing with the evening sounds of desert wildlife beginning their nocturnal activities. The crisis that had brought us to this point seemed like ancient history now, but the lessons we'd learned continued to shape our daily interactions. We discovered that truth-telling was a skill that required practice, that healthy relationships needed regular maintenance, and that love was stronger when it was based on genuine knowledge of each other, rather than idealized fantasies. "Grandma," Grace said as she helped me gather the last of Ben's birthday gifts, "I'm writing a story for school about families, and I want to include something about how people can change and get better at loving each other. Is that okay?" "That sounds like a wonderful story," I told her. "What's the most important thing you've learned about families?" She considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all meaningful conversations. That sometimes the best way to take care of someone is to tell them the truth, even when the truth is hard to hear, and that people can learn to do better if they really want to. As I locked my front door that night and settled into my quiet house, I reflected on Grace's wisdom and the journey our family had taken from crisis to healing. The secrets I'd kept for decades had finally been revealed, but instead of destroying us, the truth had created space for us to build something stronger and more authentic. At 72 years old, I'd learned that it was never too late to change patterns that weren't serving you well, never too late to practice honesty instead of protection, never too late to choose love that was based on truth rather than convenience. My memory had never been the problem. The problem had been my belief that love required me to manage other people's reality rather than trusting them to handle their own truth. Now, finally, I was free to love my family without carrying the burden of their secrets, and they were free to love me without pretending to be people they weren't. It was the kind of freedom that comes only through the difficult work of facing uncomfortable truths and building something better from the foundation up. And it was worth every painful moment that had brought us here. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.